A lot of times the business is going to come back to you and ask you, can you create a visual where I can shift between calendar year and fiscal year at my convenience? In this video, I'm going to talk about that. How do you build such a visual where it's easy for the end user to shift between calendar year and the fiscal year? And did you notice that line in the visual? Yes, we are also going to talk about that. Let's start. Before we jump into creating this particular visual, let's break down the mechanics of this particular visual and take a look at what are the moving parts of this and how are we going to go about making this stuff. So obviously, once you click on the financial year, it actually shows you the financial year. If you actually click on the calendar year, the data changes and it shows you the visual as per the calendar year. Now, there are 2 or 3 moving parts in this. Number one is obviously this particular table that we have, which is where we have used the calendar year, and switching this is going to produce a fiscal year. So that is one sort of date table that we'll have to figure it out, which is where we need both the calendar year as well as the fiscal year. That's part number one. Part number two obviously is this slicer, and we'll have to figure out that how do we actually place calendar year and fiscal year in the slicer, and that should actually interact with my visual. And finally, we'll also take a look at a few calculations that go along with the visual. So at the moment, we just have total sales and YTD sales, but hey, there could be more calculations right here. I'm going to give you a few examples and that should help you build your own calculations further. Before we start putting together that calendar or the date table, it's important to take a look at the data model first. So we have a very simple sales table right here linked with the products table with nothing but the product code. And in order for me to present the data in any sort of calendarized fashion, I need to have the date table, and the date table should contain both the calendar year as well as the fiscal year. Let's just start with that. All right, I'm going to go over to the table tools and make a new table, and that is going to give me the ability to make a calendar table right here. You can give it whatever name. I have given that as calendar. Now we'll start writing some code, and I'm going to start with a very simple calendar auto function. So I'm going to call this as var my table, and then I'll say, hey, I want to maybe use the calendar auto function. Now, there are 2 functions in DAX. You can also use that using Power Query, but for now I'm using DAX. And there are 2 functions in DAX that you can use, either a calendar function or a calendar auto function. I've discussed both of these functions in another video. In case you want to take a look, please take a look. But the advantage of using calendar auto function is that it's able to detect the date automatically from the data model. So hence I'm using calendar auto function. So let's just say that I'm using var my table calendar auto, and I'll just return that particular variable, which is my table. At the moment, if I commit on this, I press enter, you're going to see that I get a calendar table automatically created, or a date table automatically created, which is where the first date is 1st of January 2011 and all the way up until December of a certain year. Now, obviously, since I want this to be adjusted to financial year as well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this to Indian financial year, and you can adjust this to any other financial year. In India, the financial year ends in March, so I'm going to adjust this to March. I'm going to create a variable called year end month, and I'm going to give that number as a 3. Why 3? Because in India, the financial year ends in March, and hence we have number 3. Now, I'm going to use this particular 3 in my calendar auto function, so I'm going to move that up and move this down, and this is where I can use that, hey, please create the calendar table starting from April onwards. So I'm going to say, hey, this is where I'm going to say year and month, and if I now press enter, you're going to see that the calendar table actually starts in April of any particular year. Next up, we'll create a bunch of columns that belong to the calendar year and not the fiscal year. I've already written the code. I'm sure you can find the code at plenty of places. You can also download this particular file, but I'm just kind of moving swiftly by just creating the logic quickly. So what I've done is I have used this particular calendar table right here, and I'm creating 4 columns by the calendar year, which is the sort column for sorting the months. Then we have the month column, the quarter column, and the year month column. Now, at the moment, I'm returning my table, which is this particular variable, but I would rather return this particular variable. Let's just take a look at what happens if I do that. So date table, press enter, and we sure enough get 4 columns added right here. To neaten things up, what we can also do is we can just kind of give this a label. This is my calendar columns. And now let's just move on to create similar columns for fiscal year as well. I'm going to start off with the label. This is my fiscal year columns. And I'm going to paste the code right here, which actually belongs to the financial year. Now, you can obviously take a look at the code, but what the code is essentially doing is creating 4 columns, which is financial month, the financial quarter, sorting order, and the year and the month column. So if I just actually commit on this, you're going to see that we have 4 more columns created. If I just zoom out a bit, you're going to see that we have 4 more columns created, which is the month, the quarter, the sort order, and the year month. Once our columns are created, it's important that you link the calendar table with your sales day table so that the relationships start to propagate the filter. So I'm going to take the date table right here, the date column right here, and link that with the date column in the calendar table. It asks that, do you want to build a one-to-many relationship? Sure enough, that's exactly what I want to do, and that's the relationship created. Okay, quick interruption in the video. If you're enjoying the video so far, you're going to absolutely love my courses on Power BI, tax, modeling, M language. These are hard courses, more advanced courses, which is where I teach the users how to think about the problem, lay out the logic first, understand the principles of solving the problem in Power BI, and then start building the solutions of your own. Once you understand how the underlying principle or fundamental works, you'll then be able to take the same concept and even apply that to your own problems in Power BI. Hundreds of students have joined the courses and they have benefited a lot. I'm going to leave a link to the course in the description of the video, and you should definitely take a look at that. Before we move any further, let's just test out the work that we have done. That is it working in the first place or not? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go ahead and create a matrix visualization. That's nothing but a pivot table. And in that, I'm going to use the column that we have created, which is somewhere right here. So in the calendar table, let's just first go ahead and use the calendar year. So we did this year month right here. So I'm just going to drag that right here. We have year month. And against that, I'd like to present my total sales, and I can just do that. Now, at the moment, you're going to see that the year is not pretty much sorted. And that's the reason why have we created the sorted column. So let's just go back to the calendar table. In the calendar table, I'm saying that this particular column is going to be sorted in this particular order. We've already created the sort order for that. I'm going to select on that particular column, go over to my sorting right here, and I'm going to call this, hey, why don't you get sorted by this column right here? If I just go back and take a look at the visual, sure enough, it sorts in the correct order all the way from January up until the last month where the data exists. I'm going to quickly copy this particular visual, and on the right hand side, I'm going to create a fiscal year visual. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, hey, I am looking for the financial year month. So that's my financial year month. I'm going to drag that. And this again is not sorted in the proper order. I'm going to go back to my visualization and hey, say that this particular thing is going to be sorted in this particular order. We've already done that. I'm going to click right here, again, go to the sort drop down and say that this is going to be sorted in the financial year sort order. Let's just take a look. Yes, the results are fine. So we have Jan, Feb, and March, which is correct. And then the year changes, and this shows the next year, April 12, all the way up until March 12, and then April 13, so on and so forth. So at the moment, everything seems to be working fine, but these are two different visualizations. And I would want to kind of build like a toggle or a switch or a slicer, which is where I can pick up what year do I want. Do I want to see financial year or do I want to see calendar year? And depending upon what I choose, either this is going to be shown up or this is going to be shown up. That's what my purpose is. And this brings us to second part, which is where we start creating that slicer. Next up is the slicer, and the technique that we are going to use is nothing but fields parameter. I'm sure you have worked with that. In case you're not, this is absolutely brilliant. Please take a look. So I'm going to go over to the insert tab, and that's where I can find something called as fields parameter. Not in the insert tab, sorry about that. But in the modeling tab, we have new parameter, and that's where we have the fields parameter. Now in the fields parameter, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my parameter a name, which is nothing but year selector. And in the year selector, I would like to drop in the fields. By fields, I mean columns, and we have two columns. So if I just open up my calendar table, I'd like to switch between the year month, which is my regular calendar, and then I'd like to switch between F year month, which is nothing but my fiscal calendar. Do you want to add a slicer on the page? Sure enough, I would like to do that. Click on create, and that's where I have the slicer added. Now it's not really in the way that I would want it, but it actually gives me a good working prototype. So at the moment, the problem is that clicking on the slicer does nothing. So I would want something to happen in my visual. So let's just delete one of the visuals. Let's just continue to work with one of the visuals. And I'm going to say that, hey, based on your selection, I would want this pivot table to take effect. And how do I do that? I already have created this year selector, and this year selector column, I'm going to move that in the visual. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that in the visual itself. And I'm going to go ahead, and year selector right now is coming in columns, but I don't want it in columns. I rather want it in rows. So I'm going to move that from columns to rows and delete the existing one. So delete that. And right now it actually shows me some promising results. So if you take a look at the visualization at the moment, it shows me, hey, we have Jan, Feb, March, good enough. And after that, we have April all the way up until March, which is right here. And then the year changes once again. If I change that to, let's say, a year month, this actually shows me all the way from January all the way up until December, and this is working just fine. At this stage, the year month and the financial year month, they are working, but the end user would not get to know that what is the meaning of year month and F year month unless we explain that. So I would want the representation to be crystal clear, and I would want to write calendar year CY and financial year FY. Well, the way to do that is that make a slight change in our table created. So I'm going to go over to the table that we have created, which is the year selector table. In this particular table, at the moment, we have 3 columns. This particular column that is shown up in the slicer, the actual fields that are being moved as we click on the slicer, and the order. This is order number 1, this is order number 2. Now we're going to create another column in here, and I'm going to say, hey, this is going to be my calendar year, and this is going to be my financial year. I'm going to do that. I'm going to close the bracket, and this is going to create one more column, if I just maybe can do that correctly. So once we have this column created, I'm going to call this column as my year. And this is where we have calendar year and fiscal year. And now this is going to be a much clearer representation of what we are going to show in the slicer. So I'm going to go ahead, and rather than actually picking up the first column, I'm going to pick up this year column and place that in the slicer itself. So I'm going to go here and delete the year selector and just place the year. Let's just see if that is working at the moment or not. So if I click on year, sure enough, if I click on financial year, sure enough, both are working just fine. The aesthetics and the visual representation is not only the reason why we have created the calendar year and the fiscal year. There is also a technical reason which you will just understand in just a bit. But for now, let's just go ahead and proceed by adding one more calculation to our visual, which is nothing but YTD sales. All right, let's just start writing that YTD sales measure. I've already created a blank measure. Let's just take a look at how do we write that. So I'm going to go ahead with a built-in function that is called nothing but the total YTD function. At the onset, it expects you, hey, what is the expression or the calculation for which you would want to find the YTD? I'm going to say that, hey, this is nothing but my total sales calculation. Then it asks you, hey, do you have a calendar table or a date column in the calendar table? Sure enough, we have that, and I'm going to maybe lead my calendar table and my date column in there, and then I'm just going to close the brackets and press enter. This is going to give me my calendar year YTD. That means all the way from January up until December. Let's just take a look at the results for this. So I'm going to drag this calculation onto my visual, and you're going to see that the results, if I just maybe change that to the calendar year, you're going to see that the results are correct. So here we have about $1,200, and this actually keeps on accumulating the results till the time we reach December, and then after that the results are refreshed. That means the total accumulation starts all over again from December all the way up until the end of data. But if I actually change this back to financial year, you're going to see that the results are not quite correct. We would actually want to start with April. So this is where we would like to start, and this is where the total should reset to the month of April, and then it should start accumulating all the way up until March. This is the place where it should accumulate until, and then it should restart again from April. That's the way that I would want. So how can we change this behavior? There happens to be one input parameter through which we can change that. But the change will only come in case you switch between the calendar year and the fiscal year. So here the change will come, do as per financial year, and here the change is not going to come, do as per calendar year. So we'll have to create 2 versions of the calculations, and we'll have to take in account that what is selected in the slicer and then replace that in the visual. So I'm going to go over to my YTD sales right here. Now in this, I'm going to first of all take a look at what is selected in my slicer right here. And to do that, I'm going to create a simple variable, call this as var, and I'm going to say year selected. And I'm going to go ahead and choose the selected value column of the year, which is there in this particular table. Now, just a while ago, if you remember, I told you that this is something that we are not doing it for aesthetic purposes. There is another meaning to that, or technical meaning to that. Now, whenever you have the original column being used in a measure, it doesn't allow for that, and you have to use some surrogate column, some additional column that you have created. And that's also the reason why we created this column, so that we are able to pick up the value in the slicer itself. Well, I could have created the error, but I'm just letting you know right now. Nevertheless, let's proceed. So this is actually going to give us the value that what is being selected in the slicer. In case nothing is being selected in the slicer, we would want to just have the calendar year. So I'm going to provide an alternative value, which is nothing but my CY. That is going to be the value. And now I'm going to say, hey, I would want to kind of do another var and do my, let's say, calculation. This is one of my calculation, and there is going to be another calculation, which is going to be as per my financial year. So I'm going to write a very simple switch statement. So I'm going to say switch, and I'm going to say, hey, switch true, check when the condition becomes true. And what is my condition? Why don't you take a look at the year selected? If the year selected is equals to calendar year, then in that case, I would want you to happily do this particular calculation, which is working as per calendar year at the moment. But in case the year selected is as per financial year, so I'm going to write, hey, the year selected is equals to FY, then I would want you to do another calculation, and for which I'm going to tell you the code right now. So let's just copy this code because it's pretty much the same. And I'm going to say that, hey, I still want you to do the YTD. I still want you to consider the calendar date table, but the year ending is going to be done when it's March 31st. That's how you kind of finish the year and the totals are going to be reset. And that's pretty much it. So I'm just going to maybe neaten up my formula, do the return statement, and then I'm going to use my calc, do that, press enter. This should give me the right answer. So let's just go take a look. So if I just go take a look at the financial year, you can see that the total is resetting in the month of April and then going all the way up until the month of March, and then it resets once again right here, so on and so forth. If I just maybe switch over to calendar year, it goes all the way up until December from January right here, and then it resets the total again in the month of January. So this is working just all right. Before we actually close on the calculations, there is one additional thing that I would want to give it to you, which is nothing but the spillover effect. And how do you turn it off? What do I mean by that? If you take a look at the visual, the calculations are spilling over to the months where we don't even have the sales, because the calendar table contains the data all the way till the end of the calendar, which is end of December. It actually does the calculation where the sales doesn't even exist. And how can we stop that? The simplest way to stop that is by creating a check column in your calendar table. Let me show you how. So I'm going to go over to my calendar table. In my calendar table, I'm going to make a simple check that is the sales present on this particular date or not. That means, hey, take a look at this 1st July 2010. Is the sales present? Write a true or write a false. And that true and false is going to be my filtering mechanism. So I'm going to go ahead and start to write a very simple code right here. So I'm going to maybe create another leg of calculations, which is my sales check. And the logic is very, very simple. The logic is something like this. Why don't you figure out the maximum date in my sales table? So sales table date column, figure out what is the maximum date. Once you figured out the maximum sales date, why don't you take it to the end of the month? So I'm going to say, hey, EO month. Well, actually, we'll have to give the column name first, and that's the reason why this is actually giving us the red line. So let's just call this as is sales present, and then I can write my formula, that what is going to be the formula for that column. So I'm saying that, hey, find the maximum date in the sales table date column, and then why don't you take that to the end of the month? So whatever is the date which is the largest, please take it to the end of the current month. So let's just say if August is the largest date, whatever date is it in the month of August, take it to the end of month, which is 31st of August. Now I'm going to say, hey, why don't you take the calendar table, actually the current date column, which is nothing but this date column, and see that if the current date is smaller or equal to that or not. So smaller or equal to that or not. So, and that's pretty much my check. If I actually press enter, you can see that we have a true and false column, and this is going to give you a bunch of trues and falses. That means the sales existed or the sales did not exist. Now we're going to use this column as a filter in our formula. So I'm going to go back to my YTD calculation, and I'm going to say that, hey, this is good. This is giving me the right answer, but I would want to wrap this around in the calculate function to apply one additional filter. So I'll say, hey, calculate this very calculation. I'm good with that, but I would want you to apply a filter, which is nothing but is sales present, the column that I have just created. And that's it. Press enter. If I now take a look at my output, you can see that this in the financial year, it actually stops the calculation right here, but in the calendar year, it doesn't stop the calculation right here. So for that, we'll have to do that for the calendar year as well. So I'm just going to come right here. I'm going to say, hey, this is my calculate, and do that. And then this is going to be is sales present. And I can just maybe close the bracket and press enter. And then if I just maybe commit on this, you can see that now the calculation is going to stop either for calendar year or for fiscal year. The calculation stops where the data ends. At this stage, we are standing on the finished solution that works fine. There is no problem with it. We've had a big meal, but there is something missing. And that something is the dessert. That means that our visual doesn't look classy and slick and sophisticated. Let's just do that. 3, 2, 1, let's go. And you can see that I formatted the visual and it looks something like this. Now there are a bunch of things that I have done, which I will talk you through in just a moment. Those are all clicky things, not very hard to understand, and I will just take you through those things. Now, first of all, I have formatted this particular table and I've removed the grid lines and everything. And I have just also added the padding, which is space between every single row. The headlines have been colored differently. the slicer that was placed right here have been smartly brought on top of the table itself. And now if you actually click on any of the values in the slicer, this is actually filtering the visualization. I've also added data bars here along with total sales, and you can see that it just shows you that which month has got the maximum sales that you can just take a look at visibly right here. One additional thing that I have done is that I've also added this little dotted line right here that actually starts with the start of the fiscal year and ends at the end of the fiscal year. Why that? Because once you're taking a look at this particular visualization, I would want to make it very apparent for the end user that you're not taking a look at the regular calendar year, you're taking a look at the fiscal year, which is starting somewhere and ending somewhere. Now at the moment, this year is starting right here and ending right here. Now this is going to alternatively highlight every single year. At the moment we have April and this is highlighted. The next year is going to be not highlighted, and the next year that comes in the pivot table is going to be highlighted. So if you have a bunch of years, like 4 or 5 years, this is going to give you a nice cool effect of highlighting one set of year, then not highlighting, and then highlighting and not highlighting. Well, the question is, how exactly did I do that? Now that's one technique, and you can actually use this technique to do several other kinds of formatting, but here is how I did that. Now if you take a look at the highlighter measure that I have created, which is actually creating this little bar effect, I'll tell you how the bar effect was made, but take a look at the measure first. What this measure is essentially doing is that it's actually taking a look at this particular date, whatever date is it, and it's finding out that is that an even year or an odd year. So 2012 is even, and then hence it kind of results in a true, and therefore it highlights it. If I actually change this logic to is odd, you're going to see that every odd year is going to be highlighted, which is nothing but April 13 and April like all the way before that. So if you take a look all the way, this is highlighted and this is also highlighted. So howsoever you would want to design your logic, you can design it, but at the moment, according to my pivot table, the even logic works better. Once you have created that measure, I want to use that measure as conditional formatting. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I have done. So if I actually take that highlighted measure and I put that in my pivot table right here, you're going to see that this actually creates this little column right here. Now this column is squeezed down to a certain length, and it doesn't kind of show very big highlighting color. So if you actually open this up, this is nothing but my highlighted measure that you can see it right here. And this actually is producing nothing but 2 different colors. So it's producing a gray color or no color. That's what this is doing. And once you actually do that, you can actually use conditional formatting to highlight this particular column. Well, how do you do that? It's very, very simple. You actually go over to this particular visualization. Then you go over to the format. In the format, you're going to go over to cell elements and pick up the highlighter measure and then attach the background color. So if I just maybe click on the FX right here, you're going to see that we have used this particular measure. That's one. And in case you take a look at the font color, that is also this same color right here. And that's pretty much it. And once you actually reduce the width of this particular column all the way to almost 0, this shows up as a nice touch on the visualization. In case you'd like to take a look at how do you calculate growth from one particular year to another particular year using this nifty visual, here is another video for you to watch. I'll see you in that one. Cheers.